doctoral dissertation research was focused on examining Arab Iraqi refugee women's experiences of the war on terror from a gendered historical perspective. As a social worker working in the mental health field, with several years of experience working with immigrant and refugee communities, I was specifically interested in examining the trauma and mental health consequences of the war on terror for Arab Iraqi women in Canada. The specific research questions I sought to answer through my research were as follows. One, how does the war on terror manifest in the daily lives of Iraqi refugee women in Canada? What are the impacts of state policies emanating from the war on terror on Iraqi refugee women? And how do Iraqi refugee women respond to the consequences of the war on terror in their lives? I used a variety of data sources, including community reviews of relevant policy reports, news releases and research reports on Iraqi women, community observation, as well as key informant interviews with Arab Iraqi refugee women in Toronto. I analyzed the data using interpretive policy analysis and discourse analysis methods to examine different meanings and experiences of the war on terror conveyed by study participants and to understand ideological constructions of Iraqi women and their associated material consequences. Despite claims of liberation, freedom, and democracy used as justifications for the invasion of Iraq, Iraqi women's status has significantly deteriorated following the 2003 occupation. Generalized conditions of lack of safety and security, lack of infrastructure, increased gender-based and sectarian violence, combined with a rise in social conservatism and religious fundamentalism, poverty and lack of access to basic needs have led to displacement of millions of Iraqis, many of whom are women and children. Canada's response to the Iraqi refugee crisis has been widely critiqued by human rights and refugee advocacy groups as being severely limited and inadequate, fraught with bureaucratic delays, inadequate processing of applications, general attitude of suspicion towards and inhumane treatment of applicants, high refusal rates, and family separations. Despite its repeated commitment to take in about 20,000 Iraqi refugees, Canada has accepted about 12,000 Iraqi refugees since 2006, and about half of them have come under the private sponsorship program. Since September 11, 2001 attacks in the United States, Canada has implemented a series of anti-terrorism measures, including the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001, the enactment of security certificates under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, Canada's Passenger Protect program, and the more recent Beyond the Border Agreement with the United States in 2011. These measures have had differential and severely detrimental effects on Arabs and Muslims in Canada, including increased racial profiling, unlawful detentions, torture, and deportations. Within this backdrop of militarization, securitization, and criminalization, the Canadian government has also taken drastic measures that have amounted to a complete overhaul of Canada's immigration, refugee determination, and citizenship policies. Some of these policies and regulations have included the introduction of Bill C-31, Protecting Canada's Immigration System Act, Bill C-43, Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act, cuts to the Interim Federal Health Program, cuts to settlement funding and services, and changes to the citizenship eligibility criteria and residency requirements. In the following section, I will present the three key themes of violence, trauma, and citizenship that arose from my interviews with study participants, focusing on specific examples from my research interviews to highlight Arab Iraqi refugee women's experiences of the war on terror and illustrate the impacts of the recent immigration, refugee, and citizenship changes on study participants. In this research project, a key area of my analysis has focused on tracing the historical roots of the war on terror and showing the continuity of structural violence on Iraqi women's lives over the past 35 years of Iraq's history as a function of Western imperialist interventions and their intimate interconnections with nationalist patriarchal institutions, tribal, traditional, and religious fundamentalist forces. In my analysis, I have attempted to show the historical and ongoing interaction of these forces in structuring Iraqi women's lives and changing their status in the public and private spheres. The Iraqi refugee women I interviewed were mostly middle-class educated professionals who were displaced after experiencing years of hardship, war, violence, loss, and trauma. They had a stopover in Syria for a few years, living in uncertainty and insecurity, experiencing further violence and social exclusion. Now they had moved to Canada and they were trying to connect, trying to live in peace, trying to leave the memories of war, violence, and trauma behind and establish new lives, new careers for themselves and their children. Virtually all the women participating in the study shared stories illustrating the significant drop in their social and economic status as a result of state policies, war, and violence. As the examples provided by young professional Iraqi refugee women, such as Ahlam, illustrate, their whole lives have been overshadowed by war, violence, and state policies, which have resulted in a significant drop in their social and economic status. As Ahlam indicates, despite the fact that she was a trained engineer, she never got the chance to work in her chosen profession. She and her husband fled Iraq following the rise in sectarian violence and out of fear for their safety and the safety of their unborn child. Once in Syria, they had to contend with fear, insecurity, and ongoing threat of deportation, since they had to work illegally to support themselves and their young children. Moreover, Ahlam describes her persistent fear and anxiety of having to cross the border in order to renew their visas, and being exposed to the risk of kidnapping, rape, and murder by militia forces across the border. As Ahlam states, she and her husband thought their troubles would be over once they arrived in Canada. But they soon realized that myriad forms of barriers, including structural, systemic barriers, and everyday acts of racism and discrimination, prevented them from obtaining jobs in their careers and limited their community participation. Now in Canada, they were all living in conditions of poverty, unable to access jobs in their careers, experiencing racism, discrimination, and social exclusion on many levels. For several study participants such as Sundus, the structural violence of refugee determination and family reunification policies resulted in family separations, loneliness, and isolation, further complicating their historical traumas and psychological distress. Several of the women described the consequences of these historical structural forces in terms of their embodied trauma and suffering, using expressions such as, "We have arrived here," essentially tired. "Our nerves are tired. Our suffering continues." Iraqi refugee women, as well as key informants participating in the study, highlighted a number of ways in which their collective trauma intersects with their contemporary trauma, resulting from their social exclusion, ongoing structural violence, and lack of supports to produce multiple negative consequences at various levels. At the individual level, almost all the women expressed their ongoing struggles with embodied traumatic memories, depression, and anxiety. Some of the women were taking antidepressants to help them manage the symptoms, but for the most part, Iraqi refugee women said they were dealing with their psychological distress on their own, keeping it inside and showing a more pleasant image on the outside due to shame, stigma, lack of trust, and out of concern for the well-being of their family members. Many of the women emphasized the role of the historical ideological constructions and stereotypes of Arabs and Muslims as terrorists in shaping their everyday lives and limiting their participation and community integration. Iraqi refugee women, as well as key informants, shared vivid examples of experiences of racism and discrimination, ranging from being called as terrorists and getting beaten up by classmates, being ignored and pushed aside by their teachers at school, being denied access to social assistance benefits and entitlements, to being denied family reunification through stringent sponsorship policies and bureaucratic dehumanizing practices on the part of immigration officials. Despite all of these challenges, Iraqi refugee women have displayed incredible strength, resilience, and a diversity of responses to the continuum of violence and trauma in their lives. They have demonstrated their active agency and resistance to the denial of their rights, challenging the essentialized stereotypes and everyday acts of violence they encounter. Some have chosen to start wearing the hijab in defiance and as an act of protection of their own identity and self-worth. Some have taken up advocacy and public education, and some have tried to change attitudes and public perception through personal relationship building and acting as role models in community spaces. Yet there is no denying that they all continue to experience structural violence, social exclusion, and normative dehumanizing social practices in their everyday existence. These are the everyday manifestations of the war and terror in the lives of Arab Iraqi refugee women that we need to challenge and change.